Hey there, 3DMJers. This is Andrea Valdez, and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. This is a special episode of the show for a couple reasons. First off, it's an audience-sourced Q&A, which is historically our most popular type of show. And secondly, this was recorded in person with all four of the coaches in the same room at the same time when the whole crew was here at my place in Austin, Texas last month for our annual Team 3DMJ workcation. We simply asked all of you guys for questions in our Team 3DMJ Instagram story, sat the guys on the couch, and let them do what they do best. So some of the questions that are answered include, can training a sumo deadlift help build your conventional deadlift? How do you make the most out of a single body part during a single off-season? Should you focus on progressing all lifts all the time, or should you just select certain exercises? Do you have to be in a certain body fat range in order to implement refeeds? Can nutrition affect where you store body fat, or is it purely genetics? And a whole lot of other nuanced answers and conversations throughout, because as you guys know, we kind of tend to riff off of each other's answers and ideas, so this one is pretty packed with information. As always, if you have any feedback or comments on this episode, go to 3dmusclejourney.com or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/team3dmj and leave it under podcast number 116. Let's get into it. Here's our audience-sourced Q&A session 11 with Jeff Alberts, Brad Loomis, Alberto Nunez, and Eric Helms.
Can pulling sumo help build your conventional? If so, how?
I think it just comes down to specificity for the most part. Like any movement that is a hip hinge or trains hip extension or strengthens even the muscles involved with a deadlift will make your deadlift stronger. But a conventional deadlift, I find, is not that good at transferring to conventional as conventional is at transferring to sumo, in my experience. Like, you can take a conventional deadlifter and just put them into sumo, and they normally can pull a lot. And then the problem is they just like strain their adductor and jack themselves up because they're surprised at how heavy they can lift. What I do like about the sumo, though, is that for people who have a really tough time keeping their like SI joint and their lumbar stacked and not going into lumbar flexion, that's a good way to allow them to train with more volume on deadlifts. But I don't think it transfers that great from sumo to conventional, but it definitely goes the other way. I mean, they're similar enough.
I agree. I think with conventional going into sumo, once you realize that you can't, I think, specifically stack your quads that well, or your hip and knee, like exactly how you would on a conventional. Once you realize that and you're okay with that, and you learn to expect that delay, you're okay. But going the other way is usually not such a fun time. It hardly ever happens. They usually end up going back to their sumo. But no, you sometimes you play around with both. And sometimes the one you start with is not necessarily the one you end up with. But yeah, the one that you're strongest at, it's just like the more you practice that one, the better you're going to get at it at the end. I know I switched from conventional. This was pre-injury. And then I hurt my SI joint. I went to sumo, and I quit it a bunch of times because of that. It was just so different off the floor. But eventually we got the hang of it, and it keeps me safe. And if I want to pull, that's how I do it.
Your biggest pull was sumo, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I think there's also a big difference between the sumo you see in powerlifting competitions and the sumo you can do just to train. Mm-hmm. I would say Brad, and then even more so Jeff, your guys' sumo is outside of your arms, but really not that wide. And I think, like, I've been, because of my not wanting to play with really wide sumo after I got hip surgery, I've been doing much more of like a hybrid sumo. Yeah, like Jeff does it. And I found that transfers pretty well, because it's really just like the position you pick up a kettlebell in, I'm doing a deadlift with, you know? Have you guys found that going back and forth between conventional and hybrid is pretty similar weights?
Me, myself, I can deadlift a lot more sumo, a lot more than I can conventional. But thinking of a particular case that comes in mind where we actually did help a person's sumo doing conventional was a very rare condition in which the athlete's sumo deadlift, they had trouble locking out, which how often do you see that? Not very often. But nonetheless, this athlete's sumo deadlift, she had a weak back was essentially the bottom line. And so having the athlete conventional deadlift for a while helped her lock out on her sumo deadlift.
Right.
And that's really the one occasion that I could think that ever happened in my coaching tenure.
So that was conventional helping sumo, though.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah. Which I think is more common than sumo being used to aid conventional. But I do like using sumo just to, a good example is Bryce. So Bryce pulls pretty much the same numbers, conventional or sumo, and we switched. But we switched just because he can keep a higher frequency and a lower likelihood of getting really, really lingering back soreness from doing sumo than conventional. So that's, I don't know if that's transfer, but it's utility. Jeff, do you ever do conventional anymore, or are you just pretty much all hybrid?
I haven't done conventional in 10 years, maybe.
Right, yeah.
So, but my sumo, I mean, the only difference for me is I've narrowed the foot spacing over time, just because, like you mentioned earlier, just my groin area just gets tore up if I go too wide. So, from a practicality standpoint, just the hybrid stance for me works best.
I think it makes more sense from a like muscle building perspective. Like I think you get more strength out of either a conventional or a pretty wide sumo for most people, or wide-ish. But if you're trying just to find the position where you're least likely to get hurt, but also where you're still building your erectors, your glutes, quads, and your hamstrings, that's probably the hybrid sumo for most people, unless you're just perfectly built conventional. So, yeah.
By the way, I think Bryce is going to end his career being a low bar squatter.
I don't think so.
That's what he says. I called it right here. We'll go back to this. And
all right, you heard it here. Berto's wrong.
No, remember, you couldn't get him to pull sumo. He was like, no, it's just not for me.
And I got him too.
Well, you did, but he didn't want to.
We gave low bar a good college try, man. And we went into that with the same expectations and same, hey, like sumo worked well, we should try low bar. He's actually tried low bar a few times.
That high bar is it's a young man squat, man.
High bar is just for people who have that strong thoracic extension. And considering he can conventional deadlift in the high 700s, I think.
Yeah, see, he's got to stay chewy like a young man, but I think he's gonna be stiff eventually, and
we will see.
We'll see. All right, 10 years from now, we'll discuss this again. Okay, so this next question is pertaining to bringing up weak body parts. So someone just basically wants to know, I guess they've gone to the point where they see that growth isn't happening head to toe the way it did initially. They've arrived at that point where they can identify weak points. So they want to know, they seem rather confused, or like everything used to just grow. What can I do at this point in order to bring up this body part or that body part? So yeah, what would that, to-do list look like?
Yeah, I think people always end up talking about manipulating their training protocol and their training programming and their volume and their frequency. And I think that may be a place you need to arrive at, but man, most of the time, and I don't know, you guys can let me know if you agree or disagree. When I see someone who has a lagging body part and then I get to see them move, there's something lagging there. They don't like, man, there's this, all right, people could probably figure out who it is, but I've seen someone who trains calves very frequently and they don't have very good calves. And they won't have very good calves despite training them frequently because of how low quality the training is. It's like jump rope, with weights. And I'm a good example. I would say I didn't have a good back until maybe 2011 or 2012, but I'd been lifting since 2004. So you'd think with 8 years, you should know how to train your back, but I didn't. So I didn't really get like a good mind-muscle connection. I didn't really feel my lats on rows, or even really pull-ups, to be honest. I got like teres major and arm pump to death,
You had some huge teres, but
yeah,
that was it.
Yeah. So, good rear delts, good teres major, good upper back, good biceps, and not great lats. I had the classic T-taper for a while. And I think
The T-taper,
yeah. What really helped me was just getting better movement quality and awareness, and then kind of deconstructing the movement and then reconstructing it once I really felt the way it should be. So I think most people's first step should be really have someone objective and qualified to take a look at your movements. And only then should you start to think about manipulating training programming. I don't know. You guys agree with that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, I was going to piggyback on that. Many, how should we say, novice/intermediate athletes will sometimes get a second growth spurt. So they've gone through the newbie gains and, from head to toe, growth is not happening anymore. And once you do end up evaluating your technique, slowing down on the eccentric and not just slinging weight around, it's very common in the back.
Yeah.
It seems like the lats, it's like an overlying thing. We're not seeing growth there anymore, and then usually everything else falls not far behind it. But once you start evaluating your movements and start, like you said, getting quality reps instead of junk reps, getting quality volume instead of junk volume, you almost get this second spurt of, wow, I'm actually growing again, and I really have not changed anything. And I think a lot of times that's the reason for it, is because you can have, and we talked about this before, you can have a lot more unquantifiable volume if the quality of your reps is better, if the eccentric just takes a second longer instead of just dropping it. And yeah, that's kind of piggybacking on what you said that I see in a lot of novice intermediate athletes.
What's the volumes going in the right place now?
Yeah.
Because that was the same way with back. I didn't get a back until 2011.
Mm-hmm.
And I started training in 93, so sorry, but I beat you on having a shittier back for a longer period of time.
You win this one, Jeff.
But yeah, the quality, I think, just the volume goes where it's supposed to go now.
Yeah, just because you can multiply your sets times your reps times your load and get tonnage, that doesn't actually mean that the target muscle is the one doing that work. So that's very true.
I'd say my calves are genetically my weakest body part, but they're right up there with the most developed body parts, maybe even the most developed relative to where they started. And they might be the body part that I use the least amount of volume on when I look at how it's split up throughout the week. And that's just because I've gotten to the point where every rep matters a lot, and it's been working. It doesn't seem to be slowing down. So.
With that said, it may be that you're someone who does have good form and you've been at it for a while. And that is when I do think there's a value in running something like a specialization cycle to where you get your frequency higher than what it currently is. I would start small here. Like if you're currently training a muscle group twice a week, go to 3 times a week and then just increase your volume by like 50%. So if you're doing 5 sets on 2 days, do 5 sets on 3 days, but then also drop everything else a little bit so you can really focus on that. I think if you don't know who James Krieger is, that's a travesty because he's the man. But James Krieger just reported his own results of doing this, and he's been training for a long time. He's in his 40s, and also just can't handle a lot of volume because his joints get beat up. So he's always experimenting with ways to do more while not experiencing the stress of doing that. And his current experiment has been to jump up the volume quite substantially on certain body parts and drop it on the rest to like maintenance levels. It doesn't take much to maintain. And I think that's definitely a viable strategy if nothing else works, is go through a series of specialization cycles. Take 1 to 2 muscle groups, maybe 1 major and 1 minor, jump those up a solid 50%, and then take everything else to like 60% of what it was. Net total volume across all body parts, if you were to equal, it'd probably be similar to normal, but you're just distributing it differently. And I think that's typically a pretty useful strategy. That's something I've been doing on my legs for like a decade now, is basically just training them with less total sets and lower total reps, and then just going ham on my body. So,
well, a lot of times too, like even dropping volume on, let's say, good body parts, like I said, people will still respond. So how, let's say, if you're increasing your volume on a weaker body part, you're dropping the weight down, but you're probably still going to progress those stronger body parts anyway. So now all of a sudden, let's say you do improve that body part that you're trying to improve, but everything else improve with it, there's still going to be that possible gap.
Yeah.
So even though it's an improved body part, it's still going to, in comparison to everything else, it's going to still look weak.
Yeah.
So what would you say to that one?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really useful experience. Like if you take your certain muscle groups down to quote unquote maintenance and they're still improving, it may be easier just doing more volume than you needed to across the board, right? Like if you thought, well, I read X blog from someone or X study or whatever, like that's great. That's averages, that's norms. But if you think you need to do 15 sets because you read in my second edition of my books, that's appropriate for an intermediate or something like that. And then you drop things down to 8 sets per muscle group and you still progress, maybe 15 sets is just not a good idea for you, you know? So I think that's a really good point. Another really good point is that, and Berto, you've talked about this, and it's a good point, is about your calves, is that just because a body part's weak doesn't mean that you haven't developed a lot of muscle there. It just means, like, for example, I focus a lot of time on my delts, and I don't think my delts are that small. I think I have narrow clavicles and a narrow rib cage. So you can get overuse injuries from putting a lot of effort into a quote-unquote weak body part that is just structurally weak.
Because what's interesting, because remember you took those photos with Adam Ripa?
Yeah.
So from the front, he's like destroying you.
Yeah.
And then, but from the side, your shoulders are like destroying his.
Exactly.
So a lot of its perspective too is like delusions, like what pose you're actually in if you're a bodybuilder.
Yeah, sometimes you're just lucky how that muscle belly sits, and it might not even be. I know people with very impressive body parts, but when you really stop and look at it, you're like, it's actually not very developed.
Yeah.
It's just pretty.
It's got good shape. It's got the right attachments. It has good separation.
Another perspective too is you may think you have a weak body part. You might be carrying, let's say, 15 to 20% body fat, but when you lean down, let's say 10 or below, like to be competitive, then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, where'd that come from?
Yeah.
So a lot of times it can be hidden too from body fat level.
Absolutely. So basically, to recap, do you even have a weak body part? Consider if it's more of a structural issue that putting a lot of volume through it is potentially going to cause some issues. So therefore, make sure your form is pristine. Make sure the volume is going where it's intended first. And then and only then should you consider a specialization cycle where total volume stays the same, but you redistribute it. So perhaps your 1 to 2 muscle groups is up 50% and everything else is down to quote-unquote maintenance, down by a third or something like that.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are extremely excited to announce that the second edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids has just been released, and you can get them now at 3dmusclejourney.com/pyramids. It has been 3 years since our very own Eric Helms, along with Andy Morgan and myself, released the first edition of these books, and we could not be more proud of these new upgrades. Aside from a new design, layout, and graphics to enhance the reader experience, they also include updated recommendations and values throughout the text and a load of new information. In the nutrition book, we've added a discussion about energy availability, how to determine whether to bulk or cut, how to set protein if your body fat is very high, a visual chart to help you determine hydration levels, and a new section of info regarding citrulline, malate, and glutamine. It also includes entire new chapters on making dietary adjustments and measuring progress, how to peak for both bodybuilding competitions and powerlifting meets, and the entirety of the recovery diet, so physique athletes can make the transition from the stage to a productive off-season as quickly as possible. And as for the training book, it now includes a discussion about volume being calculated as sets per muscle group, a more reactive model of deloading, a much lengthier discussion on how to handle lagging body parts, a flowchart on when to adjust volume based on all aspects of recovery, stimulus, and adaptation, a discussion on auto-regulating exercise selection, and new sections discussing drop sets, rest pause sets, and super maximal eccentric training. It also includes sample training programs for bodybuilding and powerlifting, and Eric's new quick start guide to program building that is designed to help you integrate all of the concepts in the book into actual training programs and systems that you can use for yourself or your clients. Needless to say, this is as complete and up-to-date as possible here in 2019, and it is the exact set of principles that 3DMJ uses to coach and develop their athletes. If you'd like to learn more about these books, purchase these books, or watch the free instructional videos Eric made, which were the origins of these books, go to 3dmusclejourney.com/pyramids. That is pyramids with an S, because there are 2 books here, one on nutrition and one on training. And if you purchase the bundle of both, you get free lifetime updates. So every new edition will be automatically sent to you upon its release forever and ever. Again, that's 3dmusclejourney.com/pyramids. Thanks for listening and enjoy the rest of the show.
All right, so a question here. I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it. Should people try to focus on progressively increasing the loads on all movements, or should there be other movements where perhaps they use other measures to decide whether or not they're heading in the right direction?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think the answer is a little different depending on what your goals are. If we assume you are a bodybuilder, this is an interesting one. I think I would have always just used to tell people, hey, don't worry about progressing on isolation movements. Let that happen, but pursue testing or assessment of your strength on compounds, because for one, just the pragmatic reality of it, if you were doing curls with a dumbbell, you are probably going to add 20 to 30 pounds to your dumbbell curl in an entire lifting career. So that comes down to being like less than a pound per year. And you get a certain point tracking, it's just silly. Therefore, it makes more sense to make sure your chin-ups, weighted chins, lat pull-downs, rows, et cetera, are going up. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to progress. Obviously, you should. But progressive overload does not only come in the form of adding load to the bar. You can do more sets. You can increase frequency to get more total volume. You can do many ways to get progressive overload. You could just track total reps, keep this load the same, and just do more drops or rest pauses to get there. So lots of ways to get progressive overload, but I do think it's important to primarily make sure that you're progressing in your compound movements. With that said, in the short term, probably what's going to be most predictive of you being bigger is actually isolated joint strength, which makes sense if you think about it. There's a lot that goes into a bench press. Like, you can make your bench press jump up a lot just by figuring out how to bench better, getting an arch, having a little bit of that kind of J-bar path, and a few other things. And that all of a sudden will jump your strength up a lot with no change in hypertrophy. You could start doing max singles 3 days a week and not train anything else, and you would have at least a temporary increase in strength while you got smaller. So how do we know when strength is actually when size is contributing to strength? Well, if you're doing like a leg extension, there's not a lot of anything else going on there. Like, you don't need to really learn form that much. So there's some data to suggest that your ability to produce work, like your volume PRs on isolated joint movements or machine movements might be predictive of whether you're progressing. A good example right now, I've seen what really looks like some physique improvement in the last year, but I haven't been pushing loads too crazy on things like my deadlift or my squats just because of my hips. But I have seen my leg extension. I just did like 3 sets of 8 with the entire stack on leg extensions. I don't think I've ever had leg extensions that strong. And my quads are looking better. So I think that probably tells me something, because how much can you master the leg extension? I don't even think that's really a skill, So that's kind of my answer to that.
Yeah, and I think an important note is too, progressive overload in what time context.
Yeah.
Because this is often a question that we get from novices who have been training for a while, but they've gotten to this point to where they're in this trap of, well, I can't possibly drop my volume or my loads now because I'll lose muscle size and I'll lose muscle strength. And so there's this fear that I can't go down. So we have to kind of think more so in terms of the entire forest and not like, just a tree or a row of trees, because progressive overload happens oftentimes in more advanced athletes from like block to block to block. There's nothing wrong with letting your volume and or your loads come down for this period of time of maybe 4 or 5 weeks, couple months, whatever, knowing that you're going to bring it back up after that block of training. And oftentimes when you do that, now this block, you might be a little bit stronger. You might be able to handle heavier loads. Or in another block, maybe now you can handle the kind of volume with loads that used to be kind of heavy for more like training days. And so when you think of long blocks of training progressing over time, you get kind of this ebb and flow of increasing volume loads, decreasing volume loads, increasing, decreasing, but the trend line is such that you're still progressively overloading. And I mean, it's basically periodization in a nutshell.
Yeah.
But as long as like you said, the leg extension that you're doing now is either more reps or the whole stack, or more reps with the whole stack, as it was 6 months, a year, 3 years ago, you're doing something right. And then, of course, if any of those is flatlined, well, you still got the rest of the program to look at too. Maybe your leg extensions aren't progressively overloading, or you're not intently progressively overloading in leg extensions, but you are progressing quite well in a squat or a leg press or something else quad focused.
Yeah. I think something to consider also is that as you get older and as your body complains a little more with certain things, you have to get more creative to ensure progressive overload occurs. Like, for example, Jeff is not necessarily squatting anymore, but homeboy just hit 405 for 8 reps on strict RDLs. And have you ever done that before?
No, that was a PR.
Yeah, so it can still happen.
Actual RDLs, because there's gonna be someone out there that's like, I do it too. It's like, no, there's a huge difference.
Not your bunk ass RDLs where your knees come forward and you kind of squat it up a little bit.
And most of them are bunk. Like, to be honest, most RDLs you see,
most people can't.
Like,
yeah, so yeah. And also, if you see Jeff's glutes and hamstrings, you're like, I get it.
Yeah.
They're a thing of beauty, my friends.
In the gym, once a year, I see good RDLs. Once a year, maybe.
That's when we train together.
Yeah.
Like, for me personally, I kind of, like, I try to think of, like, I'm in the gym, I'm like, okay, what's practical? Like, as far as priority of how I can progress a lift. So depending on the lift, okay, what makes more sense? Load, sets, or reps? So if I'm doing, like, a lateral, okay, load's going to be very low on the totem pole as far as a priority, but okay, reps and sets makes a lot more sense. So I kind of look at it from a practical standpoint, like the RDL too. Like, okay, I know load, I can get load often, but not all the time. So I'll kind of teeter-totter it. So I'm like, okay, I'll increase the load. Maybe I get 1 or 2 sets with a higher load, and then I'll just, okay, let me back the rest of the sets down. So like that 405 yesterday, I did 2 sets with it.
Yeah.
Not, 3 or 4 like I typically do. So I'm like, okay, let me touch it for a couple sets, back it off. And then maybe the next, 2 to 3, 4 weeks, I can maybe get across the board, I'm going to get 3 or 4 sets with 405.
Right.
So I just teeter-totter it. So that way I can still kill myself and get injured, but I also can recover a lot better. That's something I've learned about myself, is the recovery aspect. So anytime you push yourself, obviously, harder and harder, the demand goes up.
Yeah.
The recovery ability is going to go up with it.
So you're distributing not only the training stress, but also the the recovery drain, if you will.
Yeah. So like Friday, was it Friday? Like a week ago, or close to a week ago, I touched 365 for 3 sets of 8, and that destroyed me. Like literally the next day, I was wiped out.
Yeah.
So I know. Okay, maybe not trying to jump load up so frequently.
Right.
So I know like the next couple of sessions, I'm probably going to back load down and just let myself kind of recover a little bit, so I can come back and progress with load again.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I look at it from my standpoint. Like, okay, what makes the most sense? What's common sense here with each lift?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, kind of.
Well, go for it.
Well, I was just gonna, like we were just saying, you're kind of thinking more down the road, a few months when you go back to 405. That you back it off now, you'll be able to progressively overload then. Yeah. Maybe not necessarily now in this next session or next week or whatever.
Yeah, because eventually I want to get to 405. Like that's now kind of like right now my sweet spot's like 315, or it was 315 to 385. Mm-hmm. That was my sweet spots. I know 385. Oh shit, that's really hard. So 365, 340. That's kind of something I can do normally. Mm-hmm. But I want to get to a point where 405 is now the top end, but it might become my sweet spot at some point. But I know right now I can't touch it all the time. Yeah. I have to kind of teeter-totter to it.
Yeah.
Brad, I also like what you said about progressively overloading then. Like, I think a useful thing to point out is that your ability to progressively overload is not the only thing. Like, being able to do more reps or put more weight on the bar is a really small component to whether or not you're going to be able to in 2 months do more. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like a useful metric of gauging if the whole style of training was useful looking backwards, not looking forwards.
Yeah. That was a quote that our good friend Brian Miner had on his journal, the
Myo journal.
Yeah, correct. What was that quote? I always get it wrong, but
I
the
paraphrase
outcome
it.
today was a result of the overload back then or something like that.
Your ability to add more weight to the bar is not a requirement for progressive overload, but the indication that it's occurred.
Yeah. Great quote too, by the way.
Like the PR, I don't look at it like, oh man, that's what's. Now I'm jacked because I hit 405 for 8. It's like, no, what got me there is what's getting me jacked.
Just hitting the sweet spot over and over again.
Like honestly, if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, like you could have, what's the most recent sets of 8 you did? 365, 385, somewhere in there? Yeah. 385 for 8 is not that much more of a stimulus than 405 for 8. It really doesn't make much of a difference from the actual like stress and strain on your body. Like I have a feeling the signal is damn near identical as far as like the actual stimulation. However, when you look at that over the course of multiple training sessions that led up to that, I was probably doing enough to make progress. So I think it's useful to not get too freaked out if you're not as strong as you'd like to be right now, but use as an indication to look backwards and say, okay, what might I have done or what might I have not done, or done too much of, or not rested enough, not eaten enough, or what have you, that hasn't got me to the point where I can do more today.
Modern day powerlifting, I think that's what's changed it quite a bit compared to how guys used to train. They used to train a little bit more in the lower rep ranges and heavier, and I think closer proximity to failure. And if you look at most modern day systems, they respect the impact that muscle growth can potentially have on their big lifts, so long as they practice their big lifts frequently enough. But what I was going to say, this is something that I'm glad that it kind of came back, because it was always a hunch in the back of my mind, was the whole mind-muscle connection thing. Because if you look at, say, the way just a bodybuilder flexes their legs, like that's a weird sequence of things that are going on to get it into a good front relax. And it's really hard to explain that to someone who just started lifting. So it's something that I feel over time you get better at doing, is just distributing load exactly how you want with certain movements. So, maybe your curl didn't go up, but you're so much better at actually using your bicep the way you intend to. So, I mean, sometimes guys feel guilty when they actually go back and load, because they discovered something, whether it be technique wise or maybe something you can't even see, but now it feels better. So I'm glad that that's slowly coming back, and it should be something that you look out for too, just as much as like progressing when it comes to just like the bottom line numbers.
That's actually a really good point. I think a lot of people who ask about progressive overload, they tend to be very analytical and numbers driven. And I know, because I'm the same way. What that means is that I will try to add reps or add load whenever I can for a block within the confines of my training program, and I'll make these little micro transgressions as to what I think is good form. And I never get bad form, but I might get like you guys saw me do the 3 sets of 20 on pull-ups. Like those weren't the best reps ever. But I knew that was I can actually do it today, so I'm going to get 3 by 20. So now what I'll do is I'll go back and I'll be like, all right, now let me try to get 3 sets of 15 that are clean as hell, and I'll rebuild back up. So I think that's really valuable to, once you kind of start to exhaust some of that quantified in the immediate short-term progression, is then go right, instead of now let's keep going with it, because eventually you go down a road of just training like looking terrible, is strip it back, go to 80% of the loads or 80% of the reps, and then just clean it up and really make sure you're putting the load where you want it to be. And then when you get back to that old PR, the quality is a lot higher. So
I kind of rank it. Like I have for me to increase, let's say, a load on any lift, it has to be a 9 or a 10 out of 10.
On your form.
Anything below a 9 out of 10, I'm like, okay, let me make this look more efficient before I even think about jumping load.
I like that. Yeah, I don't necessarily do that, but I know that I got this PB. If it wasn't like pretty, then I know that I will recycle that instead of trying to go to the next thing.
Yeah, and I do like that you kind of somewhat quantified lightening load, because one thing that drives me nuts is when people are like, okay, I'm going to lighten the load on this one, and then it just goes ridiculously light. And but the form was so much better. And it's like, well, of course it's so much better. You're curling your cell phone. You're going to have fantastic form doing something like that, So it's good to not be a puss when you're lightening your loads, Still make it so that you're forced to exert some effort.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's just important to quantify that
Yeah,
when
you don't
say
wanna,
lightning.
You don't want
load.
to get too detrained.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I literally, if I'm doing like, let's say lat pull downs, that's another one where I tend to get a little less pretty than I'd like. Is I will drop it 2 stacks down.
Yeah.
You know, not to 50%, you know.
Yeah.
And then just do the same number of reps and just make them really, really clean. So yeah, that's
because I struggle with my side lateral raises, and I'm kind of lucky in that I've got these adjustable dumbbells and I can just lighten it by 2.5 pounds. Because on an isolation movement like that, lightning load is literally like it's 1 kilo.
It's a long lever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, but I can't just up and just drop from the 25 down to the 12. Of course, I'm going to have perfect technique then.
I don't want to make it sound like I'm trying to scare people out of actually trying to increase load.
Yeah.
Like you increase load, it's a little off. It's always hard the first time you get a new weight. It's gonna feel a little awkward. Like I said earlier, like I'll do maybe just half of my sets and then back it down.
Yeah.
So you're still getting good quality training, and even though let's say the heavier stuff's like maybe an 8 out of 10.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing I've also liked, just because we're kind of talking about these small changes that maybe become more appropriate as you're getting later into your career and strength is not going to increase as quickly. I've really enjoyed pushing into higher rep ranges because if you think about it, like if you got to make a 5-pound jump on each dumbbell, that's a lot. You know, it's like a 10% increase in load if you're going from, you know, the 100s to the 105s, right? But going from, 18 reps to 19 reps, that's less than a 10%, you know? That's like a 5% if I did my math right, and I may have not. But the point is, adding reps. Yeah, exactly. Adding reps, it allows you to make a little less progress than sometimes the smallest increment load you can make.
Correct. Yeah.
What's the next question, Berto?
Oh, one more thing on that. One more thing. It was just like the mindset of progression. This is kind of a model I've been following. When I first started lifting, so I learned something from the younger version of myself when it comes to being patient. I couldn't make it to the gym the 3 times a week I wanted to make it, so I had my weights at home, and I could only do certain movements with those weights.
This is a much younger version of you.
Huh?
We're talking like 17, aren't we?
16.
Okay, wow. Yeah.
So tiny. But if I wanted to increase weights on those movements at home, I would have to go buy more weight. So that was an issue because I didn't have no money. So my thing was like, all right, you better get everything out of this. And then finally got to the point where like, okay, I've exhausted my 30-pound dumbbells for overhead pressing, you know?
You had poverty-induced practical gains. That's perfect.
Yeah, so it taught me to be patient. And then I got to the point where I can go to the gym every day and I saw like the 150s. I'm like, I'm going to get there. I don't care how shitty my form is. And that was probably, yeah. So, yeah, be patient with it, man. I think Brian's quote definitely I think that's why it resonates with people so well.
Yep.
Yeah, I saved that quote.
That's a really good one. And if those who aren't following Brian Miner, make sure you do, because it's great content.
Follow him to the store. Follow him. Don't stalk Brian.
Please stalk Brian Miner. He lives at this address.
Okay, so here we go. Okay, next question, nutritional question about refeeds. Should you be at a certain body fat level before you start including refeeds? Maybe even, might as well throw it in there, like should you have been dieting, X amount of time? So say, mini cut, you want to do a 6-weeker, do you need refeeds? Yep.
Yeah, I think need is, you don't ever really need refeeds. You could diet straight through. I think the rationale for why refeeds are effective become a little more physiologically helpful versus just psychological. The leaner you get and the longer you've been dieting and the harder you've been dieting, because then you'll be more glycogen depleted. You will potentially have greater drops in leptin, greater drops in thyroid. You'll have more stress to your reproductive parts of your body. So you'll see greater drop, like more changes in LH pulsatility in women, more drops in testosterone in men, and we know all that stuff will be corrected with refeeding at least over a couple days. But it's not to say that it won't be beneficial for someone who's overweight or obese. Like the recent study, the Matador study. This is obviously a 2-week diet break. But anytime you think about refeeding, there's always a time component because we exist in a universe that has time. So you can't just refeed for one point that doesn't exist in time. You're doing it for a day or for a meal or for 2 days or for 3 days, or that might extend into a week or 2 weeks. So I think the longer time spent out of a deficit, the more effective it is. But we do know that diet breaks can be effective even for obese individuals. So you would think that, a 48-hour refeed or 72-hour refeed would do something, probably not as effective. But it certainly seems that the rationale for a refeed would be, it probably has more of a role when you're lean, more of a role when you've been dieting hard, and more of a role the lower you get below your own quote-unquote settling point. But we can't discount the psychological benefits of refeeds if they're done right. I think if they turn into just total free days, I think that can be fine if your diet isn't creating a lot of psychological stress, especially if you have good structure. Like if you've taught someone, like let's say you're a personal trainer, you've got an overweight client, you've taught them how to restructure their meals so they're having fruit and vegetables and a protein source as their primary diet. They're not snacking between meals. They have some basic nutritional literacy, and then their instructions is to eat as much as they want until they feel satisfied but not full on the refeed days, and just eat like a normal human and feel free to go out to eat on one of your meals. Like if you did that, that's fine. They might even be in a slight surplus, but it wouldn't be anything crazy. But if you take a bodybuilder in prep and give them those same guidelines, they have a really tough time having those not turn into total blowouts. So I think when you're dealing with someone who is at risk for essentially what I would call binge eating because they're trying to diet to such an extreme place or they don't have that literacy yet, then you probably want to give targets that are actually like at maintenance calories. So it's a bit of a tangent, but I think psychologically a refeed can be a nice break. It can be a break for 2 reasons. One is it's just simply more food, so you're not as hungry and you get to have more things you want, so it's just kind of feel some relief there. But I think if you are not at risk for binge eating, I think it can be nice just to not track, or to at least step down the level of OCD-ness you're tracking with. Like I typically these days, even though like there's an argument for having higher carbs, I'll just have someone go protein calories on their refeeds. Why not? Because it's not like they're going to go like keto, So yeah.
Well, and it's you talked a lot, Eric, about the psychological effects of refeeds. Sometimes the psychology of refeeds almost take the place of the actual refeed. And, on 2 occasions I can think to myself when I said, okay, over the course of this long 3 or 4 day weekend, I don't want you tracking your calories. I don't want you tracking anything. I just want you to eat like a normal person. Whatever your definition of a normal person is, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I just want you eating like a normal person. And oftentimes, if they, how many times does a competitive person do that? Not usually. They usually are at least aware of it, of what they ate. So they'll punch things in kind of retrospectively. Okay, well, it's now Monday or Tuesday. I'm just going to see what I had on Friday. I'm going to see what I had on Saturday. I'm going to see what I had on Sunday. And obviously it's not very accurate, but there was no refeed. Calories did not go up. The calories were the same. Sometimes they were a little bit lower. Now, again, obviously it's not super, super accurate, but it was a psychological refeed.
Yeah.
And, obviously there's lower calories, and maybe that's what kind of got the result that we were after, where there is weight loss or the person is leaner. But I think it has a lot to do with the psychology of it. There was no real change in calories. It was just a stress relief.
Yeah.
And it got the result we were after.
Yeah, I've even seen people stepping off the scale result in the scale going down. Mm-hmm. It's not like huge amounts, but certainly it just lets you know. Like, and I do that once the person is already like stressing over their scale and they start doing weird things around weigh-in times and like pushing their weigh-ins back to have more time where they're not drinking water and they can go pee more. And I'm like, all right, we're done with the scale for a while because you're getting crazy on me now. And we're not actually just trying to make the scale go down. We're trying to get shredded, And then they take some time off the scale and all of a sudden they lose weight. And just you can start to see how much the process of tracking, the process of being focused on fat loss, the process of worrying about it, the process of seeing your scale weight every day not change and stressing out more is actually resulting in that, stress-mediated water retention and not losing weight. At least that's what I think is going on. And then you remove that and all of a sudden literal floodgates open a little bit.
Exactly, and your body just releases all those fluids, you know.
Exactly.
Are we talking about like a person's mini cutting? Is that what we're talking about?
You know what I think?
Or that's one perspective?
Yeah, I mean, Brad got lean at some point without using refeeds. Remember, right? Yeah. So I mean, is it like the word need? You know, if it's gonna make it better, I would almost say that it clearly better from what we've seen. I would almost say like, yeah, it's probably needed for a contest prep, right? If you're gonna diet for 20 weeks, like
I prefer to have refeeds in
probably
there,
have refeeds, right?
especially from a training standpoint to keep performance up.
But let's assume this person's just doing their cash in cut. It's not a contest prep. It's just like I want to see the results that I've been working.
I mean,
towards.
if you're asking for a refeed and it's a 6-week cut, that means like, I mean, you really don't need to be dieting then if you're asking for a refeed and then for 6 weeks if you have a decent amount of body fat.
Yeah.
Or you're dieting way too hard.
Yeah.
From my personal experience, like from past preps to the most recent preps, like I always thought like initially after the first like my past seasons, like recently, I'm like, man, I should have been refeeding all those other preps. But now I'm kind of hindsight is so magical because I can look back now and go, okay, I just dieted way too harshly in the past, even when I wasn't refeeding. If I would have eaten probably less cardio, I might have been able to retain more muscle. So I can't say refeeds is what was the game changer for me from 2014 to let's say 2006 or something. I think if it's the overall deficit, like how harsh is it? So I mean, how do we define refeed too? Is it 500 calories more? Is it 1,000? Like, so there's, to me, when I prep my athletes, I kind of just assess, like when we do implement them, where are they at in that process? How, like, run down are they feeling? Where's their training at? Is it low? Is it good? Is it bad? How depleted are they? How tired are they? How stressed are they? Those types of things. So I'll tend to auto-regulate refeeds a little bit as well. So they might not be every 7th day. They might be every 5th day or every 4th day. They might be even every 14th day. Like if we need more fat loss, like, hey, you just got to dig here. Kind of like what I'm doing now. Like I haven't had a refeed in like almost 2 weeks now. But I just felt like I haven't needed it. I mean, obviously I hit PR and RDL, so I'm like, I don't need it. I can grind a little bit more. So I tend to auto-regulate them a little bit more so based on a lot of factors.
It's kind of periodization, but in a nutritional way. Like I've set up a lot of like just quick mini cuts on Skype consults that were going to last 6 or 8 weeks. And I'm like, you know what? You don't need a refeed except for halfway through.
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea for you to diet for 3 or 4 weeks and then give you a weekend off, however you want to term that. Just don't track calories, or maybe go out for a couple dinners with your significant other and then get back on track and finish it off. That's still periodization. Sure, maybe it wasn't weekly, and it was not a certain, period of time. It was just, and it's a nice mental break too. Yeah. So kind of like Jeff was saying, you can kind of set it up so that refeeds happen as long as they happen.
Like I set people up systematically, like whether it's a 5 low, 2 high, or whatever, however you set it up, like you run it, but then as you're getting feedback from them, like
you may need to
if
adjust.
They're feeling, hey, everything's going great, and the scale's going down, I'm like, okay, well, maybe we can just bypass this refeed this week. And then the following week, they're like, okay, in theory, the following week they had more low days in a row. Their fatigue levels are going to be elevated. So maybe the following weekend would be a better place to throw those refeeds in.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can start with a structure of what it might look like, but I think just like with training, there should be some regulation based on what's happening, because nothing's going to happen the way you plan it. Like, for example, I've taught the diet periodization structure of you go 4 to 8 weeks, have a diet break, go 4 to 8 weeks and have one more refeed per week, have a diet break, go 4 to 8 weeks, have one more refeed per week, have a diet break. And then, that's like 24 weeks of dieting right there, plus 3 refeeds. That should be most of a prep, right?
Yeah.
But in reality, what I do, and what I think a lot of us do, is the first diet break doesn't happen until someone stalls. That's normally my first fix. And then I go back to see, well, could we stay on the same diet now they did a diet break? And then I'll let that peter out, and then I'll add a refeed and cut calories. And then I'll, so it's the same structure, but Whether it happens 4 to 8 weeks is dependent
different
on
numbers. Exactly.
Yeah.
Same structure, different numbers.
Exactly.
Yeah, because how many times do we see the whole structure of what we set up totally change after a peak week?
Yeah.
It is amazing sometimes. It's like dealing with a different body after a peak week. What was their dieting numbers or what was their diet break numbers is now their dieting numbers. It's just as amazing sometimes what that does, either on the psychological or the physiologic standpoint, whatever it is. It happens.
I'm almost embarrassed we didn't figure out this whole diet break thing earlier because of how many times we ran front loads and then people lost weight after that. And we were just like, well, magic. And it's like, or maybe you took them out of a deficit for a full week. They had a weekend of eating after that, and they had 5 days of being in a surplus, and they had some repair going on.
Yep, and they start sweating again, and they start talking with their hands again.
Like, honestly, I should have figured this shit out
the whole time.
In 09, like...
One thing about the refeeds, we hear the phrase like stress eater, like we all are, especially we're athletes, and I think that's where they really come in handy. Like sometimes I'll refeed if, say, I'm running a mini cut for myself, just because it's maybe running into some really important lifts that I have coming up, and I'm like, you know what, I don't want to chance it. I might be cutting, but I really want to see my performance continue with that pace. And, just like with our training, we think about how we lay things across the week so that we can get the most predictable outcome. As we know, it works better when we have food there. So sometimes, let's just say, because that's the biggest thing with the refeed versus no refeed camp when we're contest prepping. I think the most logical side that opposes refeeds that are like, hey, have your diet breaks, but you probably don't need refeeds in between, is that there's just so much that is going to happen between those diet breaks that I just find that it meshes really well with your carefully thought out microcycle to have food kind of being thrown in there, with, that meshes well with how you have your training laid out. So that's one thing we forget. Let's just say it does nothing, because I think that's where a lot of people kind of like, I don't think it does that much from a hormonal perspective that we should waste time having refeeds over the course of the week. It's like, okay, so I'll give you that, well, maybe, but just how it can enhance training during a fat loss phase, I think especially for the drug-free athlete, matters a lot.
Can I go on a science rant?
Yeah. You give it to them.
Because I'm not.
So this is a good way of talking about when people over-conclude on a lack of data. Like there was a time point where people were like, refeeds are a myth. Refeeds don't do anything. That's just a bunch of coaches making things up and chasing changes in water weight or whatever. And then if you asked them, well, like, and they would go, well, there's no research to support, refeeds. And I'd be like, well, there's no research to refute them either. And they would go, well, look at this one. 3 days of eating at a surplus with high carbs only raised BMR 7%. That wasn't actually a fat loss study. That wasn't actually a muscle gain study. That was an acute marker, and one of many acute markers that could be affected. That is an overly reductionist look at science. It wasn't an outcome-based study. That was basically fitting something else. And that wasn't even they dieted and then refed. That was just, we overfed people for 3 days and saw what happened. It took them from a regular status, I think it's a Derlewanger 2000 if I remember correctly. We took them from maintenance to surplus for 3 days and only increased their BMR 7%. What the hell does that have to do with dieting for 24 weeks and then spending, 3 days of maintenance? Not a lot. And is BMR the only thing we care about? Like what about your hormonal levels? What about glycogen levels in subsequent training? So it's only now that some of the research done at Bill Campbell's lab that's coming out, it's only published in abstracts at the moment. So it'd be really cool to see it go through full peer review and be in a journal, where we've seen that a 2-day refeed has actually improved not only muscle mass retention during a diet, but also metabolic rate. And so it's like kind of like, well, then what was the right answer? Well, in the absence of data, we have to use anecdotes, and they should be good. You should be observing a large number of clients, not just, hey, I prepped my buddy John, he did refeeds on his for his first show and it went well. Like, okay, did he do any other shows? Did you do this with Susie? What about Tim, George, and anybody else? Like, like it's not like I would say we started to become refeed proponents sometime in like 2011 or 2012. We'd had 3 years of 4 people coaching 20 to 40 people at a time.
Yeah.
And we all saw a very consistent pattern. And I think that is a much better approach. And it's not like we were selling it. We weren't writing the refeed manual in 2011 as an ebook, like we were conservative, but we went by the data we saw. And there's also a theoretical basis behind it, right? We know that there is metabolic adaptation, and we know that being in an overfeeding state for long enough does it. But you don't want to go like, right, so diet breaks work, but if you do less than a week, it does nothing. Like, that's not how the body works. Like, it's not an on or off switch, and it's not like there's some dude punching a clock, like on your 7th day, now you will get the benefits of a diet break.
And you reset the clock.
No, it's a sliding scale. It's a continuum. So anyway, that's my science-based rant. Don't be overly reductionist. Do use anecdotal evidence when that's all you have. Don't just draw a line in the sand arbitrarily, and don't say that an absence of evidence is evidence of absence, because it's not.
Before we get to the next question, we got to play a little game.
Okay.
An anecdotal game.
Anecdote.
Yeah.
Let's play the anecdote. Is this a recorded game?
Yeah, I think we should.
Okay.
I think it's good.
Let's play the anecdote game.
So here's the anecdotal game, and you guys, I want you to partake too if you've seen this. But anecdote to the science rant that you just went on. So I had an athlete that went through a very invasive prep, and I was telling him about metabolic adaptations. Your body's this adaptive machine, and it's figured out how to conserve energy. And I said, one of the things that, often happens is things you don't even think about. And so he, on a whim, because I told him about respirations and digestion and peristalsis and all this kind of stuff, he counted his respirations, like 2 weeks before the contest. He was down to 12 respirations in a minute. So inhale and exhaling 12 times in a minute. And now, of course, I don't know, he's 4 weeks, 5 weeks post-show. He's already back up to 16.
Wow. So it's a 25% difference.
Exactly. Yeah. And just respirations, which burns calories. Mm-hmm. So I just want to play anecdotal game and see if you guys have noticed anything similar to that little anecdotes.
Yeah, there's the one I think we all notice. People get cold. And like way colder than being like a little lower in body fat. Mm-hmm. Like it's the summer and you're cold.
You got the heater on in your car.
You got a heater on in your car and it's July in LA. Like, that's not normal. Other ones I've noticed are, okay, here's one. Everyone thinks they're constipated, right?
Yep, bowel movements have gone away.
But they just have, I don't even think they notice smaller poops and less frequent. And I think it's just the process of digestion goes slower. Mm-hmm. That's because I don't actually think they're constipated half the time. Like, they don't get this, like, I finally pooped and it was a lot because it was like 4 days worth. It's like, no, you just poop every 8 days now, dog. Obviously I'm exaggerating, but
they don't have the discomfort that comes with the actual constipation. Yeah.
Well, yeah, for one, it is just less food. That's something. Like,
you throw a couple good refeeds in there. Oh, I'm pooping now.
Yes, exactly.
And I think it's peristalsis. I think peristalsis goes from this
upticks again
to this.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those listening, Brad was giving us this great contraction of his hand, like it was your intestine. So you missed out. All right, the anecdote game is over. We got another question, Berto?
Can nutrition affect where you store fat, or is it purely genetics? We do see fat do funny things when it comes to storage, but...
Yeah, so I would say in the context of people who are all the way from like low, like shredded up to high normal body fat, not really. Especially in the context of people who are all eating generally healthy, balanced diets, which hopefully you should. That's first step. But yeah, there's this whole school of thought of like the biosig. That's like where when there's so many layers of wrong with biosig, which for those who don't know, that's the idea that you can pinch someone's body fat in different locations, and that predicts hormone levels, everything from testosterone, cortisol, insulin, and thyroid levels, and more, growth hormone, and all that. And then not only that, but those hormone levels that you've assessed by doing skin folds also tells you what type of diet the person should be on, and then how those skin fold changes tell you whether their hormones have changed. So for one, you're a personal trainer. Do you think that assessing hormones is within your scope of practice? No. You're a personal trainer. You're not an endocrinologist. That's technically illegal for you to do that. You're diagnosing someone's hormone panel. That's literally illegal in the United States. 2, endocrinologists, if you go to one, do you know what they won't be doing? Pinching your body fat, because they actually want to measure your hormones, not your body fat, which supposedly measures your hormones, which it doesn't. And then 3, the hormones that are actually not actually assessed by pinching fat, and then that you're not actually supposed to do in the first place, but it's okay, you're not actually measuring hormones anyway, so technically you're not outside your scope of practice, you're just wrong, aren't even predictive of the types of dietary changes or vice versa that are suggested by that program. So it's like 4 levels of incorrect and outside your scope of practice. You're like, you think you're a dietitian endocrinologist, but you're really just someone who's pinching fat and making things up. So don't do that.
That still exists, kind of. I think the one time I've seen nutrition impact how we store fat is after, someone gets into, really, really lean shape. So, they just wrapped up a contest prep, and on the way back up,
yes, that's the one time.
That's the one time
It's weird, yeah.
They will tend to usually restore it in their abdomen, but it doesn't stay that way forever. Like it goes away often just a few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, there's enough there that people can be like, well, what about, like, yes, when you see someone go through menopause, they will sometimes not actually gain weight, but you will just see a redistribution of body fat, and all of a sudden they'll be like, I'm storing it centrally. Or, for example, if you dieted down to a show, and by the end of it, like, your testosterone's dropped, your free T's dropped, your cortisol's way higher, and then you binge eat, and before your hormonal system can really kind of right itself, you store like 5 pounds of fat. It's going to go on in weird ways that's not normal. But then as you normalize again, things start to change. So that absolutely can happen if you see massive fat regain after dieting, or if you're seeing a systemic change in your hormone status, like if you go on the pill, or if you go off the pill after being on it for a long time, or if you go through menopause, or men as you age, sometimes you can go through, I don't think we have a true like andropause, but you definitely see a decline in testosterone. That can change things a little bit if you were to diet down or gain body fat. You might notice, beyond the simple fact that you don't burn as many calories, you have to might diet a little harder, that the actual way it comes off has changed slightly, but not technically like huge amounts most of the time.
Yeah, and I think probably the most obvious is, especially in women, I think Andrea touched on this in a different Q&A that we held, was when women diet down to extremely lean levels, as they come back up again, the breast tissue doesn't seem to fill out like it was before. And there's actually a condition for that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Eric.
I believe there's actually a study that showed that you see fat cell death in breasts specifically from dieting down. Mm-hmm. And that's a really common thing. Anyone who's been around the sport long enough, you'll have either experienced this yourself or your athletes have. You diet down, and then when you gain weight back up, you just notice that you don't have the same firmness, or you don't gain the fat tissue back in the breast to the same degree. And I've met a number of women who have decided to get breast augmentation or a tuck or a lift or something to address that, because they, not even always just through bodybuilding, just someone who lost a lot of weight. Mm-hmm. And then they put a little bit back on, but they just notice they have that loss of breast tissue fat. So that's not uncommon at all. And sometimes that's the reason that people are getting breast augmentation, not just because they think like the judges like it better. It's because they want to feel like they're still have that feature that they enjoyed about their body previously. So yeah, not uncommon at all. You got anything else, Bert?
Yeah, let's see. Let's do. I think we can really open this one up a little bit. Other topics can stem from it. If a client is adamant on using intermittent fasting in their life, how would you set it up so they can? So I think this is a good question, because there's not this list of optimal that we give people, but we usually have to work around many things with just about any athlete. So
yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the client's goals. Like if they're not a serious bodybuilder or strength athlete, I'd just be like, okay, and then we would do that. Yeah. But I think if they were like, I want to optimize hypertrophy and fat loss, or muscle strength gain and I really like intermittent fasting, it works in my lifestyle, I'd say, sweet. So you have coffee in the morning, yeah? And they go, yep. And I go, can we have a protein shake too? And then normally that's an opportunity to educate them. Because sometimes they're like, well, no, I don't want to break my fast. And I'm like, so what do you think about the fast that's magic? And no, there's an educational session. They start to realize that it's not a black or white switch. Fasting isn't magic. It may work really well for your hunger schedule, your energy levels. You might respond well to it. You might train more consistently without much in your stomach. All these things that might be there. But trust me, having 120 calories from whey protein is not going to be that different from having just black coffee. So I would probably get them up to a minimum of 3 protein boluses per day. Like they're probably going to eat it like 2 and then 7 or something like that. That's most common. So you can have a scoop of whey before you go to bed, or another protein serving, and then have a scoop of whey in the morning, or just some protein serving, and you basically got it. And you just get to have those 2 big meals. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I would personally, I like to experiment with giving them light meals pre-training just to see if it actually helps things. Like have 30, 40 grams of carbs on average and a small serving of protein 2 hours before training, and just compare it to how they have been training.
Yeah, often they're like, I eat 150 grams of carbs pre-training and I feel shitty. It's like, well, you don't have to, let's tone it down.
Hard to digest that.
Yeah, I think that was a little more common like 2008-9 when intermittent fasting first came out, because everyone really was convinced about like, I need to sandwich my pre and post workout with the majority of my carbs. So you'd have people on 400 grams of carbs, like you said, taking in 150 pre and post. Like that's a lot. Yeah. And eating a little more bodybuilding friendly foods and doing that with also protein. Like, yeah, you're having like 900 calories an hour before you train. Like that's not, and you're doing like 10 sets. Like, come on. Yeah. That's not needed. How about you have a third of that and you might feel way better, maybe even better than you would if you were fasted. So it's like, it's a question of not, is fasting better than eating way too much? It's a question of what's best. Mm-hmm. And you haven't even actually experimented on the middle ground sometimes. So
like I've seen individuals too, like try to use that as an excuse to pound down a large amount of food in a sitting because that's what they want to do. Yep. Not because that's what they need to do, but that's what they want to do. Like especially with preppers that, I'm going to, basically backload all my food to the evening time so I can sit down and watch TV and eat this big ass bowl of food. And then they wonder why they're, like he was saying earlier, their training maybe isn't what it needs to be, so maybe having a little food during the day makes a lot more sense.
Yep. Yeah.
So sometimes I think people are using it just as a crutch for not the best behaviors, probably.
Yeah, and I've even seen that try to be justified lately. Like, hey, do you think when we were like Paleo Man, we would just eat a meal until we felt slightly satisfied? Like, no, I'm an all or nothing thinking. I'm an all or nothing thinker and feeler. Like when I sit down to eat a meal, I want to feel stuffed. So that's how I set up my life, and it works for me. And that's fine. But like Jeff was saying, sometimes you're sitting there watching TV with a huge bowl of popcorn. Like that's not what Paleo Man did either. Mm-hmm. Like you're not actually aware of when you're not paying attention to the fact that you're eating. You're focused on something else, and you just have this craving to eat a lot. Maybe you're trying to be too lean, or maybe you have trained yourself to be that way, or maybe you would have binge eating without IF, and this is just a way to prevent yourself from gaining body fat while still having binge eating. And that might be better, but it's probably not best. And it might be even an indication for you that you should pay a little more attention to your body. Like, what does satiety feel like? Are you expecting to feel full on a diet? Are you chasing fullness to the point where you went to IF instead of just realizing that if I'm going to do a significant diet, I'm going to be hungry after meals sometimes, unfortunately. So I think getting better self-awareness and making sure that your diet aligns with your goals. Like, I don't have a problem with that for prep, because sure, like, you're going to be hungry and there's no way around it, and you're going to want to, you would binge eat if you didn't have the show, right? And you probably will after the show's over. Yeah. So that's fine. But at the same time, like if you're not dieting for a show and you're like, well, I like to feel stuffed all the time and, I would be binge eating without IF, that's a sign that something deeper needs to change. Yeah. So at least that's my take on it.
I mean, the only thing that I think I could add to it, and again, thinking more gem pop, and the enthusiast that doesn't want to necessarily get on the bodybuilding stage, is that intermittent fasting can be almost a godsend for those who are not metabolically
Challenged.
superior. Yeah, there you go. They're metabolically challenged. There you go. Because, let's face it, in today's day and age, we're not the most active that the human race has ever been. And on top of it, you have, small amounts of food that have enormous amounts of calories, So how can you possibly get full when the smallest meal will have 1,500, 1,700, 2,000 calories? Well, shoot, that's some people's maintenance calories,
Yeah.
And so I think a certain amount of intermittent fasting is kind of a godsend for these people where, and again, if you got to set it up in the context of the day. If a person trains at this time of day, well, you probably better set things up a little bit differently. But, if you can kind of hoard your calories for the time of day when you're the most active, if you're the kind of person that trains in the evening, maybe in the morning, put protein in your coffee, or something to just to keep negligible amount of calories, but not taking away so much from your daily quota that you can get a big meal in maybe after the workout, or split it up to where it's before and after the workout, to where you can actually feel full, even though you exist on some pretty low amounts of food and calories. That's been a game breaker for some people who have tried for ages to lose weight and not understanding the whole calorie in versus calorie out. And, you know what? Yeah, my maintenance calories are fairly low, and I didn't even know it, And so, it is what it is. Now that we know that, what do we do? And that's been the answer for a lot of them.
Yeah, as much as I was kind of spending some time bagging on when IF can be a problem and misconceptions around it and how it can mask more serious issues, I agree with you. Most of the time it's just useful in certain people. It's a really, really useful tool in that if you're someone who isn't hungry in the morning and you're busy and you don't have a lot of calories to play with, and it's really no struggle for you just to not have to think about food, because there's a crazy phenomenon where very, very low calorie diets, we're talking like 800 calorie liquid diets, create less hunger than normal calorie restriction, or like minus 500. It's because you're dropping it so low, your body's like, oh shit, that's not going to happen. We're just going to have to, until you get lean, I'm not going to make you hungry because this is a problem. People have recidivism with those diets because it's an 800 calorie liquid diet, and we like to eat for other, we don't just eat because we're hungry, we eat because we're humans and social, and our friends come around, and so we have problems around the holidays, etc. But it's quite easy to draw those hard lines in the sand in your brain, the way you think. Like, having rules is great. Like, just having macros and eat whenever you want and completely freestyling it, that causes a lot of issues. Mm-hmm. Like, I really think having structure, having rules, like not eating between meals, things like that are really useful skills to use. So I don't see intermittent fasting as anything else besides that. It's just, here's a set of rules that gives you structure. And if they work really well with your lifestyle, then it's probably going to go well.
Thanks so much for listening, guys. 3DMJ prides itself on keeping this show, our blog, and our YouTube channel as free and relevant sources of information for our community week after week. We also release additional free video courses as often as possible at 3dmjvault.com. If you'd like to help support our mission and our work, please consider becoming a monthly patron of our endeavors. Go to patreon.com/team3dmj and donate as little as $1 per month to our cause of helping educate and grow the drug-free bodybuilding and powerlifting communities worldwide. You can definitely choose to donate more, and if you do so, we'll send you discount codes for future use on any of our paid products. But any little bit helps, and we appreciate your monthly support in any amount that you see fit. So again, you can start assisting the team at patreon.com/team3dmj. That's patreon.com/team3dmj. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you in the next show.